and we're back with dualism. We've looked at physicalism, we've covered all the physicalist theories, not all the physicalist theories that exist, just all the ones that are on the specification. We've looked at functionalism, and we're now drawing to a close with a couple of different versions of dualism. Just like with substance and interactionist dualism, the two versions that we're going to look at are interconnected. They are not the same theory, but you do often find them coupled together. We are now up in the 1980s and 90s for these theories. So without further ado, let's just get straight into it and think about what we mean by property dualism. So we're going to be having to think about what we actually mean by property dualism, where it fits in with our current discussions, as we've been thinking about, and how it differs from other forms of dualism. Now, what we're going to be discussing is, as the extras bit of this, is what we mean by supervenience and the different types of supervenience that might be mentioned, as well as non-reductive accounts of the mind. So the reason we're returning to a discussion of supervenience and kind of talking about it in more detail is because the accounts that are being given here are not the straightforward supervenience accounts that we might have looked at before, in as much as what they're trying to explain is that supervenience can be understood in more than one way. So what we need to do is think about those different forms of supervenience so you can get a better, clearer understanding of what some of these theories are trying to say. Now, you may remember in a previous video I said that there was a kind of like a fork in the road, a moment of choice that occurred in the late 1970s and early 80s, where all of a sudden people started asking different questions about philosophy of mind. There'd been some fairly straightforward discussions and debates. When I say straightforward, they're as straightforward as philosophy debates and discussions can be, but I suppose you could whittle it down to, is the mind a completely separate thing from the body, like a soul, as we find in substance dualism, or is the mind something which is ultimately physical or supervenient upon the physical? And then there was a bit of a discussion there with functionalism, who were trying to say that, look, you can't necessarily reduce the mind down to the physical, but it at least supervenes on it. But really what we're interested in is kind of the function. And in fact, the function, or the functionalist account, doesn't require you to be committed to any particular ontology. You could be a non-physicalist about functionalism. But the point was that we found with each of these things is that while substance dualism completely separated the mind and the body, and therefore it was very difficult to see how mind and body interacted, kind of like trying to make sense of the connection between mind and body, where physicalism and functionalism seemed to benefit was to give a better account of that in some respects. But it found it difficult to capture everything that we knew about the mind, or at least that we believed about the mind. There seemed to be certain things about the mind, like that it has this feature to it, which is our personal, first-person, private, subjective, phenomenal experiences of things. It kind of missed those out. It didn't really build those into the theory satisfactorily for a lot of philosophers. Now, one of the approaches that we looked at, eliminative materialism, was really just trying to get us to jettison that. It was just trying to get us to say, stop hanging around with all those silly folk psychologists and stop hanging around with all these theories that talk about all these mumbo-jumbo ideas like qualia, and just get rid of it and just be kind of hardened scientific about the way that you approach these things. What if, on the other hand, we took a different approach and we said that the thing that seemed quite resistant to physicalism, those ideas of certain properties that the mind has that we don't think can be reduced, are actually a good way to understand the mind. That is, that there is still something irreducible about the mind, even if certain aspects of physicalism and functionalism do capture a lot of what is important about understanding things. That is, we don't have to throw away everything that the physicalist is saying. We don't have to throw away everything that the functionalist is saying. But if we attempt to just reduce the mind down to something, there is always going to be something left over. And what that suggests to us is that we need an alternative account of dualism. And so we get property dualism, as I was saying. What they argue is that there are at least some mental properties that are not reducible to, nor supervenient upon physical properties. Now, there's a few things to mention here. First of all, notice the importance of the word some in this description. It could be that there aren't any mental properties that are reducible to or supervenient upon the physical. That it could be that all of them are irreducible. But it says at least some, because when you actually look at the works of a lot of these theorists, we're going to be looking at guys like David Chalmers, for example, they're happy to accept that some aspects of our mental lives really are just kind of like functional properties, or really are just things concerning the brain. That comes back to that discussion that we had right at the start of all this, to do with the psychological and the phenomenal. David Chalmers is happy to say that there are psychological aspects of our mental lives that maybe don't need reference to kind of irreducible mental properties. But the point is that there are some irreducible mental properties. Now, the second thing that we need to point out is that this idea of supervenience comes up again, but I've put a little asterisk next to it and says that this requires further development. That's because when you're reading some of these property dualists, they will sometimes say that there is a particular kind of supervenience which takes place, but they generally argue that they're not supervenient. Now, that becomes really complicated, because effectively what they're saying is there's more than one type of supervenience, and so in the big important sense of supervenience, then no, they're not supervenient. However, in a softer, weaker sense, then yes, they are supervenient, but that shouldn't be taken as anything that tells you that mental properties are ultimately physical, right? So it is that thing of just because you say something is supervenient, it doesn't make it identical to the thing that it's that subvenes it. Now, we'll come back to that in a bit, all right? But let's have a think about this in terms of the ontology of all this. Property dualists are monists about substance. There is only one substance. There is only physical substance. So they are disagreeing with Descartes, right? They don't think that there are two substances, the res cogitans and the res extensa, the mental substance and the physical substance. They believe that there is one substance, that is the physical. However, the physical has two types of properties: physical properties and mental properties. The mental properties we might be talking about here are obviously things like qualia or intentionality, that these are mental properties, but they are not themselves reducible to the physical. Physical properties, we all know examples of these: size, shape, mass, speed, density, whatever it might be. These are all physical properties. Mental properties are not reducible down to, or some mental properties are not reducible down to, any kind of physical property. There are going to be some parts of mental states. Remember, we were talking about, kind of like facts and states and things, and properties. There are going to be certain properties of mental states which you can't reduce down. So if you think that part of being a mental state is that it plays a causal role in our behaviour, then yes, of course, there are going to be things which about our mental states which are purely physical, which are purely functional. But then there are going to be properties of those mental states which can't just be explained in terms of the functional and the physical. So that gives you an overview of basically what the property dualist is trying to argue. So I said previously that supervenience has different forms, or at least according to some of the property dualists. So David Chalmers is a good example of someone who tries to draw a distinction between different kinds of supervenience. And this is a kind of supervenience, or distinction in supervenience, that not all philosophers will agree with. In fact, some philosophers aren't even necessarily happy with the idea of supervenience in some cases. But for the purposes of our discussion, David Chalmers is interested in different types of supervenience. Let's go for a straightforward case of supervenience in our world, right? So just for the sake of argument, imagine that it's a worldwide rule that you can only buy alcohol aged 18. Now, if you need to come up with some science fiction scenario here where there is absolutely no other life in the universe other than on Earth, and the Earth is part of one global government, and the government has said that you can only buy alcohol legally at the age of 18, then the property of being old enough to buy alcohol supervenes on age. That is, that being old enough to buy alcohol isn't identical to being 18. It's not the same thing as being 18, but it does depend upon being 18. And there must be a change in a person's age for them to gain that property. That is, if you're 17 and you move to being 18, your change in age changes you to being old enough to buy alcohol, right? So there's an example of supervenience going on there. So at this stage, I'd like to introduce you to another concept, right? We're going to think about the idea of duplicates. Now, we've already talked about duplicates elsewhere when we've talked about functional duplicates, but let's just revisit what we mean by duplication here. So if A has exactly the same properties as B in some respect, we will call that a duplicate in respect to those properties. So if somebody has exactly the same functional qualities as me, then I will call them a functional duplicate, even if they're not exactly the same in all respects. If somebody has got the same physical properties as me, we'll say that they are a physical duplicate. Okay, so we only need to talk about duplication in terms of the respects that are relevant, but it could be that somebody is a duplicate in all respects, right? But just take that idea of duplication, meaning that A has exactly the same properties in some relevant respect. Okay, so if A is 18 and B is 18, then A and B are duplicates in the respect of age, even if there's other things which are different, like maybe, you know, one is tall and one is short, one is male, one is female, whatever it might be. So because of supervenience, if B is a duplicate of A in terms of age, then B is also has the property of being old enough to buy alcohol. If A is 18 and being old enough to buy alcohol is supervenient on being 18, then when B gains the same property as A in terms of age, they will also gain the property of being old enough to buy alcohol. Okay, that all seems quite complicated, but if you go through it reasonably slowly, what we're effectively saying is that some properties depend upon other properties, and so things that share those lower level properties will also share the higher level supervenient properties. Now, why were we taking that first bit so slowly? Well, it's because the next bit kind of changes it slightly, not to make it massively different, but to get you to think about it differently. So it was important that we really established what we mean by supervenience and what we mean by being a duplicate. Imagine for a moment that the multiverse is real. That stuff that you see in Hollywood movies where there's this supposed infinity of possible worlds. The world could have been different. By world, we don't just mean planet Earth, we mean kind of the overall whole structure of the universe, right? So all of the facts and principles and rules and things, the kinds of objects that exist, you know, individual people down to particular species, particular chemicals, whatever it might be. Imagine that there is this infinity of universes out there. Now, the point is that some worlds will be impossible. That is, a world is impossible if it contains logical contradictions, right? So there would never be a possible world where 2 + 2 = 5. There would never be a possible world where x equals not x, okay? So there are certain impossible worlds. There are no worlds where that fact exists or where that principle holds. There are possible worlds, which are ones which occur because they contain no logical contradictions. That is, worlds are possible if there's no reason for them to be impossible. They're kind of like not impossible worlds. So, you know, you might say, well, you know, could there be a world where pigs fly? Could there be a world where grass is blue? Yeah, of course. It could be possible because there's no logical contradiction involved, right? So our world that we currently live in, our actual world, we'll call it, is one of many possible worlds. So there are loads and loads of worlds out there that don't contain logical contradictions, you know, that they are possible because they don't contain the logical contradictions, and ours is one of those. So there could be duplicates of things in our world in other possible worlds. So here, the grass is green. There could be other universes where, other possible worlds where the grass is green. We're most likely not the only world that contains green grass. Our world contains carbon. It is likely that there are other possible worlds in this multiverse that also contain carbon. So there's going to be duplicates of things in our world, duplicates of things that are in our world in other possible worlds. So the question would be, if things like the greenness of grass exists in other possible worlds, and if things like carbon exists across possible worlds, if anything is supervenient on those things, do those relationships of supervenience hold? So is it true that supervenience holds across worlds? And is it the case that some forms of supervenience would hold across all possible worlds? That there wouldn't be a possible world where that form of supervenience wouldn't be the case? So where does duplicates and possible worlds and all that sort of stuff, supervenience, fit in? Well, let's think of it this way. Supervenience can hold within a world. That is, the supervenient relationship holds because of the particular world that we're in. So in the world that we talked about, the fact that you're legally allowed to buy alcohol depends upon and is supervenient upon your age, right? Now, that means that any duplicate of someone of the age of being able to buy alcohol, so anybody who is a duplicate of an 18-year-old or above, will also have the higher level property of being able to buy alcohol, right? The lower level properties kind of have the higher level properties attached to them. So if you're a duplicate at the lower level, you're going to be a duplicate at the higher level. But you might say, well, there are possible worlds that exist where that's not the case. I could imagine a possible world where alcohol doesn't exist, or I can imagine a world where people don't buy alcohol, so there is no need for a legal age to be able to buy it. I can imagine a world where alcohol exists, but people don't buy it, they give it away for free, or there aren't age restrictions on it, or whatever. So the point is that the relationship between age and buying alcohol might involve supervenience, but it doesn't hold across all possible worlds. It will be contingent upon the world in which that you're in. So the supervenience relationship in that case is contingent. Now, how do I know why it is and how it is that it's supervenient? Well, I can give an explanation. I can give an explanation as to how it supervenes in this world, which also gives me some indication of why it may not supervene in another world. What would have to be different, for example? So I can just say, let's not go over it for too long. We live in a world where alcohol exists and people are able to buy it because they enjoy consuming it, but because of the effects of it, we only want to sell it to people who we consider to be mature enough, and within our world, it is considered that 18 is mature enough to be able to buy alcohol responsibly, or to make that decision yourself, and therefore the legality of being able to buy alcohol supervenes on being aged 18, or supervenes on age. I've given you an explanation there in a posteriori terms, in a description of the world that I'm in. It would also mean that if that relationship didn't hold somewhere else, then I would be able to tell you the factors that were different. So I would be able to say things like, well, it might be a world where they don't have alcohol, or it might be a world where they don't use age as a way to determine whether or not people can buy alcohol, or whatever it might be. So there's a contingent relationship between age and being able to buy alcohol, which doesn't hold across all possible worlds across this multiverse. And the result of that is that we can kind of give this a posteriori explanation for that supervenience. We're going to call that weak supervenience, right? Now, what's strong supervenience then? Well, strong supervenience, as you would imagine, would probably be that it would hold across not just some other possible worlds, but all possible worlds. So if one property has this dependency relationship, this kind of dependency without identity relationship on some other property, and that property holds necessarily, then it would be the case in all possible worlds. In which case, you could say that the reason why we would explain that connection between the subvenient and the supervenient properties would be a priori. It wouldn't just be that it was kind of coincidentally true in all possible worlds. It would be that it was a priori true, that it must be the case in all possible worlds. And so we can talk about things like the relationship between being a triangle supervening on the number of sides a shape has. Being a triangle supervenes on the number of sides a shape has. So any duplicate at the lower level of this, so having the same number of sides in other worlds, must have the same higher level properties. If there's a three-sided shape, at the lower level, then being a triangle at the upper level will also be the case. That doesn't hold for the discussion of age and those higher level properties of being able to legally buy alcohol. A duplicate of an 18-year-old in another world may not have the same high level properties of being allowed to buy alcohol or able to buy alcohol or whatever. So there's two different versions of supervenience here. A supervenience which only holds within worlds and which can be explained a posteriori, and a supervenience which holds across all possible worlds and can be explained a priori. Dear God, well, what has that got to do with the mind, eh? Well, think about it in terms of the mind supervening on the body. It could be the case that consciousness weakly supervenes on the physical. It could be that in our particular universe that we currently inhabit, consciousness really does depend upon the physical in our world. It is not possible to have mental states and consciousness of a particular kind, qualia, intentionality. It's not possible to have those conscious mental states unless you have a physical body and in particular a particular kind of brain, right? The question that Chalmers wants to ask is there a strong supervenience connection for that across all possible worlds? And his argument is that there is an explanatory gap between things having particular physical and functional states and the fact that they are accompanied by qualia. That is, we're back to the hard problem of consciousness that we started this course off with. What we're talking about here is him saying it may be the case that wherever somebody has phenomenal experiences, they require a particular brain state. But what I'm asking is that true in all possible universes? If it's not necessarily true in all possible universes, we need to give an explanation for why it is that our universe happens to have phenomenal experiences attached to particular kinds of brain state. There isn't an a priori answer to this. There could only be an a posteriori one. Now, why does that seem to lead us towards property dualism? Well, it's because the attempts to provide the explanation that we've given thus far have failed. We have not been able to explain why it is that the physical state of something or the functional state of something is accompanied by these seemingly extra internal phenomenal experiences of what it is like to be in that state. And therefore, there is an actual failing here of the previous theories, which can only be helped by supplementing it with the idea of some properties which are not reducible to those explanations. This is where the problem lies. there has been this continual attempt to reduce at least some of our mental properties down to the physical, which ought not to be. It may be that some mental states may not require these distinct mental properties, but some, the property dualist says, actually do. That's the thing, they actually do require this. Our phenomenal experiences, according to the property dualist, cannot be adequately explained just by talking about the way in which the brain works, because I could give you a complete account of how the brain works and how it functions. I could give you neuroscience, I could give you cognitive science, I could give you behavioural science. If we added all of our understanding of neuroscience and cognitive science and behavioural science and all these things and put them all together, once you put them all together, you still don't get the explanation for why it is that me bumping my elbow is accompanied by a feeling of pain. We still don't get the idea of why it is that drinking, a glass of orange squash or something like that is accompanied by a sensation of the taste of orange. So what they seem to have done is mistaken a correlation between brain states and mental states. First of all, for identity, and then for strong supervenience, that this must be the case. What they're trying to explain is here, the property dualist, is that there is no evidence here for strong supervenience. There appears to be weak supervenience at best. So when we talk about the idea that the property dualist is saying that the mental, at least some aspects of the mental, are not reductive to the physical, but also that they do not supervene on the physical, that doesn't mean that they can't accept some form of weak supervenience, but they still don't think that answers the question. Ultimately, what mental states are not strongly supervenient upon the physical, and therefore they can be understood as something which is not identical nor fully supervenient upon it. The fact that they supervene happens to be the case, but it isn't actually necessary that it's the case. So we still need a non-reductive account of what mental states are in order to understand really what they are. These reductive accounts are not explaining everything.
So let's pull it all together. Property dualism. We're talking about a theory that says there's one substance, which is physical substance, but it has two properties. That is physical properties and mental properties. Those mental properties are things like qualia, that is phenomenal properties, or things like intentionality, perhaps. Mainly qualia with the kinds of people that we're looking at. They're going to argue that nonetheless, mental properties are not reducible to physical properties. That is, that even if there is some sort of weak supervenience involved, they are not strongly supervenient. So the mental does not supervene on the physical in any strong sense. So what they're trying to say is that it's not the case that any world which is a physical duplicate of ours would necessarily have mental properties as well as physical properties within it. We're going to have a look at some arguments in favour of this. So we're going to look at a famous argument produced by Jackson called the Knowledge Mary argument, which is a very famous argument that you might have even heard of before, or heard the argument before, even if you don't know the name. And we're actually going to look at our first bit of Chalmers doing some arguing in philosophy. We're going to look at his philosophical zombies argument, which is, again, a very famous argument, which kind of restarted discussion about property dualism in the 1990s. We're then going to look at the associated criticisms and issues that come along with that. And we're going to look at other issues like how property dualists can approach the interaction problem, by looking at epiphenomenalist dualism, which will be in the following week. We will also be doing the usual thing of looking at how these different theories apply to each other. So one of the things that we'll be thinking about is how it is that property dualism could use its arguments against the previous physicalist theories in order to try and undermine them, as well as maybe the possibility of being able to undermine things like functionalism. Okay, then, there we go. Last but one video done. See you in a bit.